I think it's weird when people ask if violence is natural, or if eating meat is natural, or if infidelity is natural, or whatever else. It's like you would never even ask this sort of question about the behaviors of rabbits, or ducks, or snails, or any other animal. If a bunch of ducks were regularly getting up to something, you would never think, hang on, is this natural behavior? Because the behavior is automatically natural by virtue of them being animals. So, implicit in these sorts of questions is a positioning of humans in a special place above other species, where some of our behavior is outside of nature and, more remarkably, outside of our own nature. And some of you are comfortable with that positioning. And I might not be able to make a persuasive argument against the idea that humans are special for their ability to transcend their own nature. But I could take you on a graveyard tour of dead ideas about human specialness. We used to say humans were unique for our tool use, unique for our ability to have culture, unique for our culture-gene coevolution, for our non-kin cooperation, for our ability to wage war. All of these claims to human uniqueness, and more, have by now been put to bed by multiple examples in other species. And since I know language is ringing in your ears as a potential candidate for human uniqueness, I'll paraphrase my old advisor at Boston University, the anthropologist Matt Cartmill, who quipped that researchers come up with a new definition for language whenever the old definition is discovered to apply to another species. I believe it's currently in vogue to say that generative, hierarchically structured syntax is what makes human language unique. We'll see. I'm skeptical of anything that delineates humans from nature, and I'm skeptical that within humans, we can delineate between the natural and the unnatural in a meaningful and helpful way. I'm skeptical that it's worth asking whether a behavior is natural. That is, I'm skeptical of the very implications of asking. As far as I can tell, what people label natural is some integral of old and achieved without cultural technology. And what people consider unnatural is some integral of novel and assisted or facilitated by cultural tech. This is where the snake starts to eat its own tail for me, as there is nothing more natural to the human animal than engaging in novel, complex, culturally mediated behaviors. So, maybe asking something like, is monogamy natural? Just isn't an interesting question. Or maybe I'm naive. Maybe it is interesting, maybe very interesting, considering you can get different answers to that same question out of different academics and, indeed, different parts of academia. You'll hear many, not most, I don't think, but many in the broad fields of cognitive and evolutionary anthropology describe humans as more or less a polygynous ape on a leash. So much so that I've seen the term maximally constrained polygyny used to describe human monogamy, as peculiar as that might sound. And there's an argument for this. Male humans seem to want multiple mates more than female humans, on average. And that psychology could suggest a history of polygyny, right? To paraphrase David Buss, mating preferences couldn't evolve unless they resulted in behavior, at least sometimes. Further, some of our closest relatives, the gorillas, engage in polygyny as their primary mode of reproduction. And finally, most convincingly, most human cultures, most of them, for example, the Pashtun societies of Afghanistan, or in much of West and Central Africa, or among the Savannah Pume of South America, or among small Mormon spin-off sects in the United States, most human cultures at least have some formal polygyny. That is to say, if you go by a culture head count, a majority of counted cultures would allow for a single man to marry multiple women. And so the argument that polygyny best approximates our ancestral state isn't a bad one, but we are going to come back to it. And while we're here, I'll note that there are some examples of formal polyandry in humans. famously in Tibet, but I've never seen anyone actually argue that human nature is for one woman to marry multiple men. It's usually discussed, right? Polyandry is usually discussed as an exceptional response to exceptional socio-ecological circumstances, rather than as a potential default state. So I won't spend much more time on this possibility. Now, if you speak to enough people about this topic, especially very left-leaning non-academics, as well as academics from certain non-evolutionary fields, you'll occasionally hear that humans are naturally unstructured polyamorists. Which is to say, back in the day, polyamory is what we did, and it's only because of culture that today that's what we don't. And this usually sounds like a free love view of multiple mating. I've heard that jealousy is a pathological social construct, that marriage and even monogamy are oppressive tools of the patriarchy, and that if all of that were deconstructed, we'd all give ourselves to one another relatively freely, and even watch on and join in as others give to each other unselfishly. At least in person, I've only ever heard this view from people who are skeptical of evolution's impact on the human mind. Which is peculiar to me because though this polyamorous ancestors hypothesis can sometimes masquerade as suggesting an absence of evolved mating psychology, it really just suggests different evolved mating psychology. Right, I'm talking about people who really enjoyed the book Sex at Dawn because it did a contrarian version of evolutionary psychology, and they really liked it, paradoxically, because they don't like the project of evolutionary psychology. I guess I'll share the main reason I'm skeptical of this bonobo-inspired story. Across the tremendous diversity of human mating systems that I've read about across 2 anthropology degrees, I can't remember reading of one culture that approximates the degree of sexual freedom that this group insists is our default state. Multiple mating, affairs, informal polyandry, and polygamy, these things are quite common, but completely unstructured, unjealous love? That's not something I've run into. Maybe the Moswell come close? This might be too cheeky, I'm stepping onto the high wire here, but outside of urbanites deliberately contriving polyamory, I'm being sincere when I say that the closest I've heard of to an organic expression of the sort of mating they're describing, I've heard about from frat boys. And I'm not sure that that's the past these folks are imagining. Of course, some of you who took the same anthropology classes as me will know that Margaret Mead described these Samoan youths as having something like a free love practice of unstructured, uncommitted, unjealous mating. But you should also know that, first, this still isn't quite what we're talking about. I mean, this is still a culture with marriage, just one with a supposedly relaxed polyamorous premarital stage. And second, many people in anthropology think Mead was wrong. Many think she was deliberately wrong to serve a political purpose. Others think she was wrong by accident, right? There's some evidence that the Samoans pranked her. Basically, they told her all these incredibly gory stories of free, wild human mating for a laugh. Allegedly, that's what one of the Samoans said they did to Mead. Right, it was all a big, elaborate prank on the gullible foreigner. Personally, I don't have a strong opinion, and the debate about Mead's reporting has frankly become too political for me. People have started arguing about it more like lawyers than scientists, and so we'll just have to put a pin in it by saying that even if Mead was entirely accurate in her telling, in fact, even if there is some culture I've never heard of where humans live with the liberalism of bonobos, it's more telling that if any cultures have practiced this lifestyle, not many have. If we are naturally unjealous, sexually liberated creatures, it's conspicuous to me that in modern, secular nations, where social permissiveness of promiscuity is extremely high, and where any half-decent looking person can combine the cultural technologies of dating apps, clubs, and contraception to safely pursue a number of partners that would make Margaret Mead's accounts look tame even in those environments, the median number of lifetime sexual partners is somewhere between a few and several. And most of us are in monogamous relationships right now. If free love is in your nature, there is less constraint and more opportunity to live by that nature than ever. You really can go for it. And yet most of you will pick one person, split rent, and watch Netflix. I'm sure you can hear that I'm skeptical of the idea that our human ancestors were like Brooklyn's hipster polyamorists, and less skeptical, but still skeptical, of the idea that we are default polygamists. So, I guess I've shown my hand. I think our story, the human story, is mostly a romance. I think we had a lot of monogamous behavior in our ancestry. And in as much as we have a default, right, I think we're very flexible, I think this is what we default to. If I'm right, though, if we are a naturally monogamous ape, we're certainly not monogamous in the pair bond once and never stray type of way. I mean, basically every person in any relationship ever has been attracted to alternative mates. I saw a study of a few hundred people in relationships that asked about extra pair fantasies, right? Do you think about other people? 80% of women and 98% of men in that sample said they'd had such fantasies in the last 2 months. And a huge slice of that group will eventually act on that attraction. Look at the infidelity rates in ostensibly monogamous marriages. 1 in 4 marriages would be a conservative estimate. And why stop at infidelity? Look at the divorce rates in attempted monogamous marriages. And why start at marriage? Look at the infidelity rates in dating couples, sometimes over 50%. Or look at the breakup rates in dating couples. I mean, really, to any married person listening who hopes I'm going to say today that humans naturally mate for life, think for a second. Who did you mate with before you mated for life? Maybe 1 in 20 of you can say nobody? But that doesn't mean we're not monogamous. This is confusing, but when scientists talk about monogamy in animals, they don't mean one mate and only one mate forever. They usually mean social monogamy, sometimes social serial monogamy, usually with extra pair mating. DNA tests indicate most animals who engage in monogamy do not seem to do so perfectly faithfully. And most monogamous animals do not mate with only one partner for their entire lives. So, when a biologist says monogamy, they generally mean one mate at a time, at least as far as they know. Without doing an opinion poll, but having spent several years lurking around various anthropology departments, I'd say this is the most common description of human nature. While we are phenotypically plastic, while we seem to adjust our mating pattern to fit local socio-ecological conditions, humans are serially monogamous apes who occasionally engage in extra pair mating. This view is what you'll normally hear, right? That we are, as much as we have a default, we default to serial social monogamy coupled with infidelity. And if we're going to do polygamy, we lean more towards polygyny than polyandry. That's the normal mainstream story that you'll hear from most of the people who really should know. You can also find explicit articulated arguments for this view from Helen Fisher and from the influential evolutionary psychology article, The Ape That Thought It Was a Peacock, and more recently, the 2019 article, Are We Monogamous? These are all in the bibliography, which also has citations for every other point made, as usual. I'll review some of the usual evidence you run into here. First, morphologically, we look like monogamous apes. In polygamous apes, you see big size differences, right? Because the males have to get big to fight to be head of a multi-mate family. In monogamous apes, you see small size differences, because such conflict is less common. If we have a strong history of polygyny in our lineage, our bodies don't show it. Okay, I mean, you might intuitively think that men are much bigger than women because it's socially salient to you as an animal. Male gorillas are about twice the size of female gorillas. That's a polygynous ape. Male humans are what? 10% bigger on average? Maybe 20%? Aliens would have a hard time telling us apart. Okay, I mean, just using the eye test, we look like a monogamous ape. Second, psychologically, the emotions of love and jealousy very much seem geared towards getting us to focus on one person and then stop them from seeing others, right? And jealousy exists in our species even where it is socially punished. My conversation with Brooke Shelza is a good place to start on that. Third, even in cultures where polygamy is permitted, typically the vast majority of people don't pursue it. As Stuart Williams points out, for perspective, cultures that are over 20% polygynous are often coded as highly or generally polygynous. Take a step back and think about what it says about our species. That even highly polygynous cultures are mostly monogamous. It's what we humans, by and large, actually do. It's what the ducks are getting up to. And for what it's worth, non-paternity estimates, right? You are not the father rates, indicate that humans are more faithful than most species we code as monogamous. I said in the last episode that 3% would be a high estimate for human extra-pair paternity. Well, monogamous birds are more like 20%. And you might say, oh, Mackin, where's the model organism? Right? Like at least the various crowds saying poly is our nature have gorillas and chimps and bonobos to point at. Where's your ape? Well, we're going to talk about my ape for the rest of today's episode. Typically called lesser apes for their smaller size, although that'll be the last time I call them that. Today's guest calls lesser the L word and argues we should abandon it. Here, I'll call them the lesser known apes, the singing, swinging creatures who, like most members of our species, mate in a serially, socially monogamous fashion, with imperfect fidelity. Folks, I'm happy to say the star of today's show is one of our closest relatives, our closest monogamous relative, our closest musical relative, the Gibbon. We're about to hit a variety of topics with today's guest. We'll discuss Gibbon homicide, or Gibbonicide? Gibbicide? Hylobaticide? I'm not sure. We'll discuss the function of singing in gibbons and ourselves, monogamy and the evolution of monogamy, and please don't have a heart attack, but I did splice in the duet of the Skywalker Gibbon right around where we start talking about songs. I figured it would be useful for everyone to hear, but I don't want to surprise anyone. I also want to give a heads up that we talk about the threat of infanticide quite a bit, and listening back, I'm realizing we're going to sound pretty paranoid to anyone outside of biology. Animals, primates, sometimes kill unrelated offspring for competitive reasons, and so considering behaviors and traits as potential anti-infanticide adaptations is pretty common in the literature. We specifically discuss monogamy as a potential solution to infanticide by giving a male high paternity confidence and good reason to protect their partner's offspring from rival mates, and in a way that might sound paradoxical, we also discuss infidelity, extra-pair mating, as a potential solution as well, since it confuses neighboring males who, now, have reduced incentive to commit infanticide, as they might be the father. And if none of that made sense, we're about to get much more into it. I've wanted to discuss gibbons further for quite some time now. I think it's intellectually criminal that cognitive and evolutionary anthropology largely ignores this ape. And so I did some Googling, looked up, who's the top expert on gibbons, and I found some names, and I chose one, and I emailed that person, and they very kindly said, no, you want the gibbon expert for your show, you really should talk to Dr. Susan Cheyne. Susan is the co-director of the Borneo Nature Foundation International and the Borneo River Initiative for Nature Conservation and Communities. She is the vice chair of the IUCN Section on Small Apes, and she is also a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes. So, she's a very busy person, and we are very lucky she made time for us today. Thank you to all the donors for sending Susan a microphone, paying for our hosting, and just generally making this show possible. You listening can support the Species Project at macandmurphy.org. And if you want to talk to me more about this episode, you can do so easily in the YouTube comments or on my Instagram broadcast channel. Dr. Cheyne has been focused on gibbons consistently for about 27 years, and we condensed as much of that as we could into the next hour. Enjoy. What are gibbons, or who are gibbons? Could you tell me about gibbons as a clade, how many species there are, and what those species generally have in common?
Yeah, the singing, swinging apes, although they are quite a bit smaller than their great ape cousins, they are nonetheless apes. So, a cousin of ourselves as humans. They're only found in the forests of Southeast Asia, and there are now, we've identified 20 species, and they're found in 11 different countries. So geographically, they cover a really big area from eastern India across to Vietnam, southern China, all the way down to the tropical forests of Java in Indonesia. We think they form a monophyletic clade, so a clade with just one sort of origin. And we do know that within of those 20 species, there are 4 genera. But what it seems within the gibbon genetics, which is quite fascinating, is that these genetic splits are quite recent in terms of evolutionary time, and there's a lot still going on. So exactly how they all relate to each other is not very clear. You could get 10 different people in geneticists working on gibbons in the same room and get 10 different answers, all of which might be correct. We do know that between the different genera, there are different numbers of chromosomes, but what makes them the same is these incredible morning calls that they make, songs, duets between the adult male and female in a group. Also, interestingly, compared to the other apes, is there's virtually no difference in body size between a male and a female gibbon, at least when they're adults.
You described that they're swinging apes. Are they all arboreal? Are there any ground-dwelling gibbons?
Nope, they are all completely arboreal. They do not come down to the ground unless they have to, and that may happen if they are in extremely fragmented areas where they simply have no other way of moving. To give you an example, at one of my field sites in Indonesia, we've had camera traps across 8 different forests, almost continuously in some places, since 2008. We've got nearly 45,000 pictures of animals using the ground. Those are individual animals, so no duplicates. We have one image of a gibbon. Many orangutans, wow. Many red langurs, many pigtail macaques, longtail macaques, one picture of gibbons on the ground out of 45,000. They just don't come to the ground.
Remarkable. And so I guess I'm getting kind of a picture here as to what unites these 20-odd species. They all sing. They all are brachiating arboreal creatures, right? So they're swinging from the trees all day long. Is there anything else? I guess one thing that might be missing for some people who are maybe listening while driving and can't go to the trouble of looking up an image of a gibbon. If you were on a walk in somewhere like you said, Vietnam or India, how would you know that you'd seen a gibbon as opposed to another form of primate?
The main thing is actually you'd be looking for something to be not there. So they don't have tails. What they have got are very long arms and legs and very striking facial pattern or colors of hair on their face. I guess to give an image, so I'm gonna, if this is not something that other people are familiar with, in the UK we have something called monkey bars that kids play on in playgrounds. It's just a set of bars. I think they have them kind of in the Olympics, and kids climb up and then swing across them. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
I do. They have one at my local gymnasium, and I'm sometimes caught using them and pretending to be a gibbon.
Yep. So that's basically how gibbons move. They just do it better and faster than we do. They also do it fast enough that when they really get up to speed, they can actually get to the point where they have so much momentum behind them that they will swing and actually completely let go of any branch. They will effectively be flying
Wow.
before they then grab onto the next branch and carry on. So don't try that at home on monkey bars, please. You're not a gibbon. But they can get up to that speed, and they've got that decision making process that literally in midair they know what to grab onto next so that they don't plummet to the ground at high speed, but they carry on swinging.
Could you describe first, I guess, what adaptations allow for these acrobatics? Like why is this possible for an animal to swing this way physically? And on the other end, do we have any idea why or how, and I guess to an extent that's the same question, why or how they evolved this ability?
Well, we have some ideas. Now, obviously, the best way to do an anatomical study is to actually have the animal in front of you, and to do it ethically, you have to wait for maybe an animal in a zoo to die. But what we think we know is that basically brachiation is a really energy saving way of moving, and their shoulder joints and indeed their wrist joints are particularly well adapted so that they're just very good. I'm not an anatomist, so forgive me if I'm getting this a bit confused. But basically, the sort of distribution of energy as the hand grips on, and it doesn't grip, and I'll come back to that, is there's a really good way of passing that kinetic movement energy through the wrist, through the arm, and through the shoulder. And that ball and socket joint in the shoulder is particularly well adapted to allow them to do that very extreme form of movement, that brachiation. And I think also, if you imagine, again, our hand, if we're grabbing onto a monkey bar, we are grabbing it, and we can almost close our hand around it where our four fingers touch our thumb. Gibbons can't do that because they have a reduced thumb. So what they do is they don't grab as such, they hook onto branches, which means they're just literally touching onto a branch with their four main fingers, not really using the thumb. And we think that as well, because they're not having to grab and kind of swing round, they're literally hooking and going. This is another way of limiting the amount of energy that's required to do this. So although it looks to us like it might cost a lot of energy, it doesn't. And again, going back to a playground analogy, if you imagine you're on a set of swings, when you're swinging forward, you tend to put your legs out straight. And as the swing comes backwards, you pull your legs up into a sort of tuck, because that creates better kinetic momentum and motion and makes you swing higher and faster. That's exactly what the gibbons do. At the lowest point of the swing, their legs will be properly extended all the way down. And as they swing kind of up to carry on, they'll pull the legs up into the body. And again, that's another way of maximizing the body to help movement. Yeah, it's a lot of good playground analogies with gibbons.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking to myself, thank God playgrounds exist. Otherwise, I'm not sure how we'd get through this description in a way that was relatable to people. While we're on the point of describing gibbons, I think it would be useful, since they are apes and since we are apes, to cover you mentioned body size similarities. That's something quite interesting to me. But what else differentiates gibbons from other apes? And then also, it might be useful to discuss, I guess, what makes them apes, or what similarities they share with other apes by virtue of being them.
The main thing I think that makes the gibbons more similar to us, I suppose, is yes, there's that lack of sexual dimorphism. I mean, yes, I know you can generally point out that amongst humans, male humans tend to be that little bit bigger than females, but not in anything like the same level of differentiation we have between, say, a flanged male orangutan or a silverback gorilla and the females. Interestingly, I think as well from a behavioral perspective is that if you look at the the roles of the adult male and female within the group, there's quite a lot of sharing of the responsibility of both territorial defense and finding food, and not quite as much when it comes to raising the infants, but it's, gibbon fathers are not totally hands off. They're not totally hands on either, but they do contribute. In terms of them being also apes, it's not just the lack of tail. They have the same dentition as us, the same number of teeth. Gestation period, so, length of pregnancy, is actually very similar to humans, despite the fact they're so much smaller than us. They're, 9-10 kilograms for the small gibbons, and the siamangs, the ones with the throat sacs, maybe up to 12-14 kilograms. But their gestation period for pregnancy is about 8-9 months. So quite similar to us. Their structure of the placenta, as far as we can tell, is actually very similar to us. Interestingly, something we don't quite have an answer to yet is that when we work with the great apes, so the gorillas, bonobos, chimpanzees, and orangutans, particularly out in the wild, so my field site, we have orangutans out in Indonesia as well, is if we can collect a sample of urine, we can use a very small amount on a human pregnancy test kit, and it's about as reliable as you would expect it to be for a human. It does not work on gibbons, on any species. Now, we think there might be something that there's a protein perhaps that gibbons are producing that means that these pregnancy test kits are utterly unreliable. So that's something, I suppose, that perhaps a difference, but then that's not something that the public or even many researchers would come across.
Yeah, there aren't many opportunities to pregnancy test a gibbon.
No, indeed not. They don't tend to have twins. That's something else quite interesting. But again, twins are very uncommon amongst most of the apes. We humans, we're a bit of an exception.
I'll double click on that briefly. Is there a evolutionary explanation for why humans are more open to having twins?
I'm not actually sure the answer to that. I mean, I think part of it is that, there's obviously a genetic component as to why twins are more prevalent, and it seems to go down the female line. I think perhaps probably there could, and this is an educated speculation, part of the reason as well could be is that twins are extremely energetically costly, both to carry in the womb and then obviously look after afterwards to the point where they both survive. And I think possibly one of the reasons that we have more twins amongst humans is that as human societies developed and we came to live together as groups, there were more humans around to look after twins. So it wasn't just the responsibility of the mother and father to look after the twins. There were helpers. There was the wider community. And therefore more twins survived. Therefore, the genetics for twins became more common throughout the population. Twins just are so uncommon in the wild, in all the apes, great and small, that when they do occur, unfortunately, generally one of them doesn't survive. There's just not enough nutrition. So I think, if twins are not surviving, the genetics for twins are not being passed on. Whereas in humans, I think that I honestly don't know the answer to that, but that would be my best supposition.
Yeah, I mean, that makes quite a bit of sense. The increased alloparenting among humans making there less selection pressure against twins. I mean, it's certainly not, the norm in humans to have twins, but maybe it's just not the norm because it's just less of a disaster with all the helping hands around. What's a typical day in the life for a gibbon?
Well, it's an early start. Generally, gibbons will wake up before it's light. So obviously it varies because they occur across such a large geographic region, but around about 4 a.m. they're going to wake up. They will start, again, if it's not been pouring with rain, generally they'll wake up, maybe move 1 or 2 trees over and start singing pretty quickly. So they'll often start singing before it's light. And that can go on for any length of time. Sometimes generally the male will start the duet within an individual group, and the female will join in. Singing bouts of a morning can last for a couple of hours, so generally they'll finish after the sun comes up. Then the gibbons will head off, moving around the territory, partly patrolling the territory, partly obviously seeking food. Late morning, there'll be some sort of downtime where they'll all come together. Quite often there'll be social time, play. The length of how long this lasts will generally depend on how if the female has a very young infant, because she needs more time to rest. Then more travel, feeding, and they often go and find their sleeping tree between sort of 3:30, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
So wake up, a couple hours of singing to start the day.
Yep.
And then adventures. That's very interesting. How did you actually come to study gibbons?
I think from a very young age, I knew I wanted to work with wildlife, but I knew I didn't want to be a vet. Originally I'm from the west coast of Scotland, so I spent a lot of time on the beach with wildlife. Through my father's job, we lived in Zambia for a very long time, and I always imagined myself going back there to do work. So I studied zoology as an undergraduate, and it's a 4-year degree in Scotland. I went to the University of Edinburgh, and towards the end of my 3rd year, there was a poster up on the notice board in the zoology department, so looking for something to do over the summer. And it was looking for people to volunteer and go out and work, at a gibbon rehabilitation project near Phuket in Thailand. It was a centre that was rescuing gibbons from the illegal wildlife trade and hoping to rehabilitate them and, if possible, return them back to the wild. And I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. So I went off to Thailand for 3 and a bit months to this project, which is still going, and being very successful, and I'm still working with them. At the time, there were lots of problems with it. There was a lot of lack of scientific approach to the rehabilitation. These gibbons have been kept as pets in very poor conditions, and very often hadn't seen another gibbon, and needed lots of rehabilitation. And I felt that it could be done better. Came back, finished my degree, and then tried to get more work with primate conservation. Worked in a bar for a while, still trying to find something in Edinburgh. Actually then spent a year in South Dakota, in the States, with a friend of mine who was doing her PhD, studying mule deer, white-tailed deer, mountain lions, and coyotes, all the time trying to put together a proposal for a PhD, which I did eventually get at the University of Cambridge. And again, I thought I was going to go back to Thailand, but actually at the time, there was a French chap, Cheyne, who was setting up a gibbon rehabilitation project in Indonesia. And we got in touch through my supervisor, David Chivers. And he said, well, look, Chinese looking for someone to kind of document this and show it can be done properly. You're looking for somewhere to go. So I went to Indonesia to do my PhD with the Callaway program. Again, it's still going, very successful. And that was it. I kind of stayed within Indonesia. And since 2015, I've also taken on the coordination role for the IUCN's Primate Specialist Group section on Small Apes, supporting bringing together everyone doing anything to do with gibbon conservation, whether it be wild, rescue centre or zoo. But basically, I went to Thailand, I saw these guys, I saw the impact the pet trade was having on them, and I heard them sing, and I fell in love with them.
Lovely. Great. And then what's it been like actually studying? What was the process of, and what is the process of studying gibbons?
It's challenging in the field, certainly, because if you want to find them, you've got to be up before they get up to be at their sleeping site when they wake up. So they're very, very, very early mornings. Much caffeine is needed, but it's fascinating. It's being out in the forest, and it's still dark. And yes, you're falling all over the place, but then you get there and you're in the forest when the gibbons start singing. You're there when the sun comes up. It's just absolutely magical. I mean, it's particularly in the wild. Obviously, we're in their home. It's an absolute privilege to be able to see that behavior and work with habituated gibbons. Obviously, it's not appropriate to habituate gibbons in every forest. They're not all protected. But it does give you that fascinating insight into what they do, how they behave, what their day is like. And obviously, what's the word? Driven by science. But I think, we have to remain in awe of nature itself, even though we're working to study it and protect it. It's really important to sometimes just sit there and appreciate the magic and the incredible diversity of song and everything. So, yes.
Sounds wonderful. So, as a student going through anthropology departments, I noticed there's an awful lot of talk about the great apes, right? Chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas, and substantially less talk about these apes. I guess one possible reason is, as you've just described, their early divergence. But do you think that there's other reasons they're generally left out of the anthro conversation?
I think it comes down to the words we use. I'm not sure why there has to, other than the fact that they're bigger, I don't know why there has to be a distinction based on size. Unfortunately, a word that no one should ever use, the L word. Do not say lesser. There's nothing lesser about them. They are smaller, yes, but I don't think having any distinction based on size is helpful. But I think that has unfortunately been something that has both captured the imagination of the general public and indeed funders, especially when we're looking at evolution, that gibbons are a simpler kind of ape and therefore don't have anything to bring to the table to tell us anything about human evolution. So I think part of it is the language we've used has in some way closed us off to exploring gibbons, and this is slowly changing. Even for example, again, they're across 11 different countries across Southeast Asia, and every single one of those countries has multiple myths and legends and stories about gibbons. Art, culture, all about gibbons, very definitely about gibbons, not any other species. And again, much of this has been overlooked. And I think there's a parallel here, and I'll talk about one of my other great passions with cats, wild cats, as well as, my own domestic ones. We have, again, what we call big cats and small cats. And again, when it comes to funding, the big cats are the ones, again, people tend to know, the lions, tigers, African leopards, cheetahs, of which I think there are 7 species that are considered the big cats. And then there's all the small cats. So the Scottish wildcat, flat-headed cats in Borneo. And the clouded leopard is one of these ones that, depending on who you speak to, it's either a small big cat, in which case you can apply for funding along with other big cats like tigers, or it's a big small cat. Therefore, and somebody did a study on this where something like 90% of conservation funding is going to the 7 big cat species, and therefore only 10% of cat funding is going to the 34 small cat species. And this, again, is based on this arbitrary language distinction between big and small. They're all wild cats, and they all need help.
Our evolved psychology to pay close attention to megafauna has led us to
yes
spend more funding.
And you might have noticed I find this quite annoying.
Yeah, I mean, it is annoying. I totally empathize with you there. I mean, that's a very frustrating problem to run into as a conservationist. I guess I'll kind of drag us back to the ape side of things, because it's very interesting to me as someone who's been on the more cognitive and evolutionary side of anthropology, more so than primatology, although I did have to do coursework in that area. How much weight is put on the other great apes as models for our behavior? Not models as in role models, but models as in potential tools with which to understand ourselves, right? And this has always struck me as quite strange. It's unlikely you know this, but my research background is in human mating behavior, right? And there's a whole lot of talk in this discipline about what bonobos do and what gorillas do and what chimpanzees do. But our closest relative that does anything like what we actually do, right? Even though most human cultures allow for polygamy and there are some subsets that allow for polyandry, the vast majority of people in those cultures and the majority of people on Earth mate in a serially, socially monogamous fashion, right? We form these pair bonds, generally male-female, and stay together for some period of years, sometimes much, much longer. And by my lights, the only animal or the only close relative of ours, right, the only other ape doing something like this is the gibbons. And so I'd be very tempted to look at what they're doing to better understand ourselves. I mean, to put kind of a finer point on it in terms of similarity, and you already mentioned this, the other apes are very, at least chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, these are very dimorphic creatures. I mean, I think we have this heavily socialized impression that men and women are very different physically, right? That men are much, much bigger and much, much stronger than women. And that's certainly true that men are stronger and bigger than women on average, at least in terms of upper body strength. But compared to other animals, we look remarkably similar. If I were to just, conform to the social roles in terms of dress and styling of a woman, I could easily be mistaken for a woman, right? I could easily come across that way. A gorilla could not perform that sort of maneuver because they're so dimorphic, and a chimpanzee similarly. Gibbons, however, are, very similar in terms of body size as well. So we've got this kind of physical similarity with gibbons. We've got this social similarity where we generally engage in social serial monogamy. And I mean, I don't want to stretch the homology too far, but we also are quite noisy as apes, right? There's two apes that love to make sounds with their mouths, and it's us and the gibbons. I mean, we're doing this right now. I mean, conspicuously, everyone listening to this podcast has used the cultural technology of headphones and the internet to get some ape sounds in their ears because we like it so much. What do you think about gibbons as a model for study for humans who are interested in human behavior?
It's a fascinating question. Part of me wonders if comparing mating systems is the correct way to go about this, because obviously we can see mating systems now, that's fine, we can go out and study them. We have maybe a little bit of an idea of what the mating systems might have been in the past. But without a time machine, we really don't have that much detail. And I wonder if we're focusing that on the wrong question, is that understanding the drivers of the social system. So what has resulted, the apes that live in the same places, gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos, in ecologically similar conditions, why have they developed different social systems? And same for the gibbons and orangutans. What has driven them to develop different social systems? Is it an adaptation to finding food? What benefits, clearly gibbons and orangutans, despite being so incredibly different, can survive in the same forests, same habitats. But yet you don't find orangutans, you find orangutans in 2 countries, where you find gibbons in those 2 countries plus 9 more. And I also, and this is where, we need, I don't know how, we probably need to, go down the pub with a drink, but understanding the evolution of monogamy, etc., in human cultures, some of it was driven by necessity, we think. Some of it was, there's an argument that also religion has played a role in that in humans, that
Yes,
it was less about managing resources and more about meeting religion. So I think in short answer, we need to get Doctor Who. We need a TARDIS and a time machine, and we need to go back and have a look at it, because that's the only way we're going to figure out what's going on.
Well, let's see if I can't push a little harder on this point. I mean,
Sure.
totally taken that there's the religious angle as to monogamy evolving, but just from kind of a philosophical point of view, I would say that humans have multiple variation producing mechanisms, right? We produce variation genetically, like all other animals, and we produce variation culturally, like many other animals, right? And we also seem to produce variation in a much more individualistic level, with things like creative intelligence adapting on the fly to the immediate circumstances, right? So we've got all these different layers of variation production, and I would expect there to be some behavioral ecological similarities that encourage selection for the final output phenotype, so to say. So you spoke about how, there's, for whatever reason, we've got these apes, and I mean, kind of thankfully, because if we didn't have so much mating variation, we would create simpler stories for ourselves. So it's kind of a gift that we have these, I won't say living fossils, but living models of different mating systems being possible within the ape clade, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine if all the great apes engaged in monogamous pair bonds, it would be like an open and shut thing. It's like, oh, this is just what we do. But just because of happenstance, we have this incredible diversity where we see something like free love, hippie-style free love among the bonobos. We've got very interesting and different multiple mating among the chimpanzees. We've got harem polygamy among the gorillas. And then we've got, I actually don't know, is it, I mean, this is what people talk about when they talk about gibbons. They talk about the cute pair bonds and things like that. Is that actually universal to gibbons? Are there any gibbons who are doing different things, or?
So, yes, the monogamy part of gibbons is a little bit too simplistic. They are, as you mentioned, indeed serially, socially monogamous and highly territorial. I mean, they will vigorously defend their territory from other groups. As to the sexual monogamy, there is increasing evidence that not all species are indeed sexually monogamous, that some will, both males and females, engage in what we call extra pair copulations.
This just makes them more like humans. The analogy is only getting better.
Well, indeed. Yes. But they always return to their original group. So while they may, play away from home, they always seem to come back. Now, collecting genetic samples off an arboreal primate and making sure that what sample you pick up and you know exactly who has produced it can be challenging. Equally, obviously, you're dealing with the poo, the feces of endangered species, and moving that around and making sure you can carry out the correct genetic tests is not easy. So we don't have detailed genetics for many of the species. A lot of it is based on behavior, that basically we see multiple breeding females within a group. So that obviously means then, okay, well, if you've got two breeding females in a group and one male, that's not quite monogamy. But again, they will still defend that territory. So we just published a paper from my team, I think last year, that recording the first case of polygyny in Hylobates albibarbus, the white-bearded gibbon in Borneo. It's been reported many times for the Nomascus genus, which is up in mainland Asia, eastern mainland Asia. So there is certainly an argument that says, we can't rule things out just because we haven't seen it.
But for the most part, broad strokes, while there are clearly exceptions, the kind of default mating system, in as much as they have one, is, again, kind of similar to modern humans, mostly serial social monogamy with infidelity. I guess I kind of have a second, and again, I say modern humans, just meaning that the general population of people on Earth right now are mostly doing serial social monogamy. Obviously, there are many cultures where that's not the case universally. Do we have any leading hypotheses for why this behavior, which is, just for listeners' sake, very unusual among mammals. I mean, there aren't a lot of mammals engaging in serial social monogamy. It's actually much more common among, I don't know if it's coincidence, but the other arboreal animals, the birds.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that gibbons engage in serial social monogamy? And then also, what likely benefits, and I get this might be a more complicated question, but what likely benefits do pair bonded gibbons get from engaging in extra pair copulations, what we would call infidelity in humans?
This is where again we need the time machine. So one theory, if people are familiar with particularly bonobos and chimpanzees, you'll be aware that females have very large, very obvious sexual swellings when they are at their most reproductively fertile. That's a very, very clear, obvious signal to other females and, of course, the males that now might be a good time to mate. Gibbons, while being, living in these very strict social units, the females obviously have got sexual swellings as well. They're very, very, very small though. Very difficult to see in the wild from a human perspective down on the ground. Obviously, a male being in close proximity to the female would see them much better. But a gibbon's sexual swelling at its sort of peak, obviously, is quite bright red, but it is only about the size of a 50p piece. Basically, if you put your thumb and forefinger together, that's roughly about the size of the sexual swelling, so significantly smaller than what you would see on a chimpanzee. And one of the theories behind what might have led to the monogamy, of course, is that you can only see this if you're in close proximity, which means only the male can only see it if he's spending time with the female, presumably grooming and with her. But of course, it is an indicator to him that, okay, this female is at her most fertile at the moment. Now might be a good time to mate, to potentially guarantee that I'm going to be the father. So one of the theories behind this is that actually it's an indicator of paternity certainty. Now, if the male is certain that he is, obviously he's hopefully certain when he's mated, but then he has then perhaps more certainty that the infant being produced is his. Therefore, it's better for him to hang around because he's more likely to be the father of that infant. Therefore, he can hang around and defend a territory that is full of high-quality resources to feed the female and his infant.
I didn't know that about the reduced sexual swellings in gibbons. It's again, quite interesting because much is made of that as a delineator between humans and the genus Pan, right? Our closest siblings. Is that we have reduced and potentially no swelling at all in human women, and I've heard similar stories about there's an incentive for a male human to stay around because of this. That's the only way to gain paternity certainty is to be in proximity throughout the cycle. But for me, there's a bit of a question begged, and I'm sure you were about to answer it, but I kind of want to get us there. Where are the incentives for the female to switch strategies in the first place? Right, there are obvious benefits, genetic diversity wise, and a paternity uncertainty, right? Protection against infanticide and things like that. Things that Sarah Hardy described. There are benefits to multiple mating as a female ape, right? And what changes strategically where it's like, I actually, those benefits, I want to push those to the side, and I'd actually benefit more from having a male that's sticking around all the time, vigilantly mate guarding me, but also guarding the territory and potentially helping with some co-parenting. I recognize I'm giving you, lots of information every question. It's just a complex topic. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it really is. I mean, it's been suggested that this strategy is indeed to avoid infanticide. I don't necessarily agree with that because where we see infanticide or where we suspect infanticide, we see it. As you mentioned, Sarah Hardy and the Hanuman langurs. It's never been seen in gibbons. So it doesn't seem to me like that is a valid explanation.
Could it be similar to the old joke about the tigers where, you see this person doing a really silly dance and you're like, why are you doing that outrageous dance out here? and they say, oh, I'm doing it to scare off the tigers. And then you say, well, there are no tigers. And they say, it's working, right? Could it be that this is a strategy to protect against infanticide that the gibbons are very effectively executing? So let's say female gibbons switch to a more monogamous strategy in order to guard against infanticide, and it panned out perfectly, and now the species is free of it.
That's the other argument. Is I don't know. I just, when we look at, and again, this is a large gap in our knowledge. Young gibbons, as they reach sexual maturity, they will start to be pushed out of the family group, males and females. So they will disperse. They will go somewhere outside of the family group and hopefully, find a mate and establish their own territory and raise a family. We have very, very, very limited information about where these young gibbons go. Even, who goes at which distance. Obviously, you can't. We suspect there's no point. A sub-adult female going one territory to the west, and then when her younger brother grows up and becomes a sub-adult male, and he goes one territory to the west, and then you've got a brother and sister in the same place. We would expect there to be some mechanism to avoid inbreeding. Whether it's that males disperse next door and the family carves out a bit of the forest for them, and females disperse further, or the other way around, as some way of avoiding inbreeding, could mean that actually all these groups in relatively close proximity to each other are in some way related. And there's a slight, not precedent, but one of my colleagues, again, working in the same site as me, looking at orangutans, and she's seen this happen with female orangutans, that there's this sort of complex distribution of related female orangutans. So a mother with sisters, daughters, nieces, they all in a complex, clear system of overlapping home ranges. Again, a male orangutan, whether flanged or not, will leave the family area to avoid inbreeding with, as it seems now, multiple female relatives. So they will travel very far away to get away from where they were born. So possibly something similar than that is happening. So you actually have this loose-ish coalition of many related females or males, we just don't know. In which case, the problem is that doesn't quite explain why both males and females are engaging in extra pair copulation. No, it does actually. Because if a lot of the females in an area are the unrelated ones and the males are, it would make sense for the males and the females indeed to mate with different ones. Many, 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 many gaps in our knowledge.
Yes, understood. But if I'm tracking this right, the mainstream idea with gibbons is that monogamy evolved so that the females could obtain protection from infanticide, and their bodies adjusted such that the optimal male strategy was indeed to stick around, right, and have high paternity certainty, incentivizing them to do so. And then on the other end, infidelity or extra pair copulation evolved in order to grab some genetic diversity in a context that you just described, a socio-ecological context, where genetic diversity is relatively hard to come by. Am I following correctly,
yes,
or have I lost the plot?
You've put that much more succinctly than I have, yes.
I can hear in your description of this, though, that you are a little bit skeptical, or maybe a lot skeptical, of this infanticide narrative for the evolution of monogamy among gibbons. Is there an alternative explanation that you favor?
Yes, I am skeptical about the infanticide. I very much get your point that, if the strategy is so effective, we no longer see infanticide. That is one of the arguments supporting it. But if that's the case, then why do we see multiple females giving birth within the same group and that being tolerated? And I mean tolerated between the females, because obviously infanticide doesn't have to be necessarily carried out by males. It's more commonly carried out by males, but infanticide equally could be carried out by females. So part of me also thinks it's simply down to the lack of sexual dimorphism, because when we look at what we know about division of labor, for want of a better word, gibbons are very egalitarian. Yes, it seems like the male does a little bit more of the traveling, in the sense that he ranges not very far from the female, but ranges a little bit farther in terms of territorial patrolling, as will the subadult with him, if there is one. The female will tend to take a more direct line through the territory. Again, they'll all be in, at least, if not visual, auditory proximity, only probably because she's got to conserve energy if she's pregnant and or, carrying an infant and lactating. But she does seem to lead the group. And when it comes to territorial conflict, the entire group will get involved up to a point. Again, if the female's not got a dependent infant, she'll be right up at the front. They'll all be singing, always. But if the female doesn't...
Wait, so how big are gibbon groups?
So normally it's an adult male, adult female, and 1 to 5 offspring.
1 to 5 offspring.
Sorry, 1 to 3 offspring, so 5 total.
1 to 3 offspring.
Yeah.
5 total. Okay, that's quite the crew. And you're saying that they all engage in territorial defense as a team, and that the I don't know what, if there's a better term, but the romantic relationship is quite egalitarian.
Yes.
It's interesting that you note the sexual dimorphism, the low sexual dimorphism, because we see that co-occur with monogamy across the animal kingdom, right? And this is one of the more physical anthropology style arguments for humans having strong monogamous tendencies as a species, is that we just don't look like we do anything else, right? We look like monogamous apes would look, in the sense that we don't have that many differences between male humans and female humans physically. But I don't want to get off track. This is the first time that I'm hearing body size as a potential cause of monogamy rather than a consequence. Could you expand on that?
If one of you is slightly bigger, then the most of the territorial defense will fall on that individual. However, if you're both the same size, you have more. The adult female can help in this case. So if you think about, you've got 5 individuals. So say you've got adult male and female, a subadult who would be 6, 7, a juvenile, maybe 4 or 5, and maybe an infant who's still a little bit dependent on mum, around 1.5, 2, because the interbirth interval is about 3 years. That means that you've got at least, you've got definitely the adult male and the subadult who can go into battle, so to speak. So while they will all contribute to a territorial dispute in terms of alarm calling and singing, you'll have the subadult and the male who can actually go and engage in the chase fighting. Now, when I say fighting, I don't mean direct physical contact, but I mean chasing, shaking branches, skirmishes, I suppose, across the border. The adult female, if she's got an infant who's somewhat dependent on her, she'll hang back. She won't take the infant to the front line, so to speak, and the juvenile may or may not go. If you've got a group where there's the female hasn't yet given birth, so you've got a juvenile, a subadult, and the adult female who's not yet carrying an infant, then you could potentially have all 3 of those gibbons, not the juvenile, but the adult female, the adult male, and the subadult going to the front line. Which is why when people ask me, can you always tell who's going to win a fight between the habituated groups that we follow in Indonesia, is no, because it depends how many gibbons take on this physical chase display behavior. Does that make sense?
I want to ask more about it, though. I'm kind of trying to touch what gibbon life is actually like. They're living in these small familial groups, not that dissimilar from the Western nuclear family,
yep.
Except in terms of structure. But in terms of lifestyle, it sounds like they're doing quite a bit of territorial warfare. I mean, you speak of the front line. I understand that they get quite noisy to try and discourage, and to be clear, they're territorial towards other gibbons, right? That's a key variable. They're not. Are they territorial towards other animals? I have no idea.
They are extremely territorial towards other gibbons. Depending on the other species, they will mob other species that they perceive to be a threat. So, a threat and/or in their feeding tree. So they will mob orangutans. They'll mob clouded leopards, in the sense that they will all jump around in the tree and shake the branches of the tree that the animal is in without coming into contact with it to basically tell it to, leave, which doesn't always work.
Yeah, do gibbons put hands on each other in disputes, or is it all kind of bluffing and making noise and getting in each other's faces?
It's mostly the bluffing, getting in each other's faces, but when physical contact happens, it's pretty brutal. They've got extremely large canines. They can cause a heck of a lot of damage.
Do gibbons kill each other?
They can do.
Wow.
It's especially problematic if a lone gibbon goes into the territory of a family. They will attack. They will physically attack.
Fascinating. And how high is I don't know if this is something that we know. I know that they're quite difficult to study. How high is the, let's say, gibbon murder rate? Like, is this a serious threat between gibbons?
Where it actually results in the death of another individual, I can think of 3 examples over the last 70 years of gibbon studies. So no, it's very, very, very uncommon.
The singing and bluffing works.
Yes.
I hope the audience is tuned into the fact that this is sounding less and less like human singing as we go on. Is the word sing appropriate here?
I think singing is appropriate. These are incredibly detailed, complex calls with multiple frequencies, notes. They're species specific, so every one of the 20 species has its own species specific call. Within that, males and females have individual calls. And then within that, of course, each has an individual voice. So the songs have multiple functions. Yes, the most common one is the defense of the territory. Most mornings, when it's not been raining, gibbons will find a fairly tall tree towards the edge of their territory, and they'll just broadcast their calls, just to tell all the other gibbons, we're here, this is our space. The actual number of times that gibbon groups come into conflict, it will vary depending on the species and population size and numbers. It's not that often, because these morning duets are they're basically a spacing mechanism. We're here, this is our patch, don't come in. But within that, these calls, they also serve another couple of functions. One is to communicate within the family group. So one is to basically reestablish the bond between the male and the female. And you can actually see how long a male and female have been together based on how cohesive their duet is. If they've just met, they're kind of talking over each other a little bit. They're not quite they're not perfectly coordinated. Whereas a pair that's been together for many years, decades, literally there's a split-second difference between the female finishing, and she's allowed to completely finish, and then the male comes in perfectly, rather than overlapping each other.
Wow. So
territorial defense, re-establishing the pair bond, communicating within the family, but also communicating with other groups. And what's super important about a young gibbon who growing up within the family, so a young female will learn how to sing by copying her mum. Young male will learn how to sing by copying the adult male within a group. Is that when they disperse, the voice is their calling card. as a male, a calling card to a female. He's going to broadcast everything about himself in his song, basically, hopefully telling other available females how good he is, and therefore they should form a group together. So
Fascinating.
yeah, it's their dating system, I suppose. So it's incredibly detailed and complex. The functions of the singing. It's not just about being aggressive. Indeed, the whole point of the song really is to try and avoid these conflicts.
Yes.
Because most mornings you're waking up and going, "Hey, folks, we're still here. Don't come in." But yeah, like I said, when a young gibbon leaves the family group, the voices there, yeah, their calling card, their way of telling other gibbons who they are and indeed where they are, in the hope that then they will find a compatible mate, establish a territory, and have more gibbons.
Wow. Okay. So the Gibbon song, it seems to be functioning, I mean, I guess some human singing serves the same function. I mean, we sing romantic duets to try and establish the pair bond. And, Lord knows many people have taken to singing to try and attract mates to varying degrees of success.
Indeed.
I suppose there are some cultural contexts where we've also, seen people sing war songs, although those are generally not, not meant as warnings so much as, intimidation in the act of attack. I don't know of any territorial singing in humans, but it's very interesting, and it sounds like the well here goes much deeper than just announcing an auditory perimeter. Beyond singing, how do gibbons communicate with one another? Is it mostly the song, or are there other ways that gibbons chat with each other and get information across?
Definitely, yes. And this, because the songs are so easy to record and hear and things, there's been so much more work done into them. But what the non-song calls, they definitely make them. There's much less information available about them. Definitely, there are little contact calls that you will hear between a mother and a very young infant. Very young infants, when they're unhappy, will cry. There's what we call contact calls between the group. If they've been traveling around for a bit and they all come together to feed or groom when they come back to their sleeping areas. There are not mating calls, but there is a very subtle mating noise that the male and female will make. There are play noises that young gibbons make when they're playing, or playing solo play, or playing with each other. These are very difficult to hear. They're very, obviously they're unpredictable when they're going to happen. Whereas the morning calls, they're very time specific. As I said, unless it's been throwing it down with rain, most of the time they will sing. The reason they don't sing after it's been raining is that they're cold and wet and miserable, and they just want to go and have breakfast, which is fair enough.
One other point that I'm quite interested in, given that the other apes are so famous for their intelligence, do we know anything about how gibbons compare, right? Do we have any notable examples of gibbon problem solving or tool use? I mean, one thing that comes up a lot in the ape literature is, self-concepts and things like that, understanding of abstract ideas. How would you say that gibbons measure up against other apes in terms of their cognitive capacities?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it, because I think that, inverted commas, the sort of traditional way that we test intelligence, I would argue doesn't work for gibbons, because their intelligence is different. I'd sort of joke, but not quite, that they're the Formula One drivers of the primate world. It's been shown that F1 drivers have, I can't remember the details, but there's something specifically different in their brain to other people that allows them to make split-second decisions at ridiculous speed. The gibbons do that. They can be literally in mid-air going through the canopy, and they know what branch to grab onto next so they don't plummet to the ground. That is incredible, constant, high-speed problem-solving. Now, they can use tools. They've been shown to use tools in captivity. If present, they can solve problems. They just don't need to in the wild. So I don't think the fact that they have not been seen to use tools in the wild is any indication that they are less capable. They just don't need to. They have definitely got mirror self-recognition, and I absolutely know, I'm convinced, if they can identify other individual gibbons based on their song and social proximity, physical proximity to the call, they know exactly where and when food is going to be available within their territory. They have these mental maps because they'll return to the same tree at the same time of year, even though this particular tree doesn't fruit for 2 years. They'll come back to the same place at the same time because they know. And also, I know they absolutely behave, they recognize us. Our long-term field teams out in Indonesia, they recognize us and they're like, okay, fine. Because they behave very differently when we bring new students out or film crews. They know that that's a different human. And they can definitely recognize each other. So they're absolutely intelligent. Just, yes, they don't use tools. I mean, if we're talking about culture, is their song not cultural? It's culturally passed on through learning. So yes, they're intelligent. I think just we're not using the right ways of measuring their intelligence.
I'm glad you made the points you did. There's a lot of flavors in what you said that are reminiscent of Frans de Waal's writing on this topic. He had such a great anecdote in his book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? About, it was kind of a thought experiment, right? He said, when we measure other animals' intelligence, we like to measure it using, in a very self-flattering way, tasks that we excel at, right? And he said, imagine a intelligence test designed by squirrels, where they say, okay, squirrels, in North America, they hide thousands of nuts, right, throughout their environment. And then an entire season passes and they can remember, some large percentage of where they've hidden these, thousands of food items, right? And he said, imagine squirrels design an intelligence test to try and figure out how smart humans are. And they have us hide thousands of objects around our environment and then try to find them again months later. We'd all flounder. In terms of location memory recall, humans aren't particularly great, and I know this because I struggle to find my phone, wallet, and keys every morning before I leave the house. And I can so imagine, if gibbons were to design an intelligence test to figure out how smart humans are, and it had something to do with, rapid decision-making under speed, in a three-dimensional environment, we would be floundering and cast away as one of the ignorant animals of the kingdom. So totally appreciate that our traditional ways of measuring intelligence probably not fair, given that animals are adjusted to their environment and their intelligence is adjusted to their environment. And so what's smart in the canopy isn't going to be necessarily what's smart in the lab, let's say.
To be able to do what they do, it's a very different level of intelligence. And I think, even just speaking not only about gibbons in the broader sense of how we measure intelligence, I think that, there's still not really consensus, I think, on how we measure intelligence among humans. And if we haven't even got that down, then how on earth are we supposed to try and study it in non-humans?
You've mentioned the pet trade, and if I understand it, gibbons, one depressing similarity that they have with the other apes is that they have some serious conservation threats, which you've been a large part of helping to ameliorate. What are the threats facing gibbons today?
The two biggest really are the loss of their forest environment. As we've mentioned, they are completely arboreal, very, very simple: no tree, no gibbon. And the illegal wildlife trade. Now, the trade there is both for live, generally young gibbons, and by young I mean less than 2 years old, for pets, illegal, or for parts of gibbon for traditional medicine. And unfortunately, over the last few years, a great deal of the sale of gibbons, all of whom are protected in every single country where they live, so protected by every country that where you find a gibbon, and protected internationally, you can go onto social media and with relatively little effort, you can find a gibbon for sale.
That's disconcerting.
Yes. We have teams at the moment, well, across every range state, looking at this issue, and it's bigger. It's a bigger problem in certain places than others. Indonesia, in particular, has quite a lot of trade in Indonesian species just within Indonesia. Malaysia has a lot of issues with this. Thailand has a big problem with pet trade. It also has an issue with what we call photo prop animals, where not just gibbons, but other wildlife are brought to tourists, placed in the tourist's arm. The tourists are charged a fee to pay the owner of the animal to have their photo taken. And tourists think this is a fabulous thing to have their picture taken with a cute gibbon or some other form of wildlife. So yes, tackling the drivers of this, tackling the social media platforms who are allowing this to happen, is an enormous task. So please, primates are not pets. Not a single species of primate should be kept as a pet. So please don't. And please don't engage in, don't go and pet primates when you go abroad. There's lots of guidelines on the IUCN websites in many different languages about how you can safely go and see primates in the wild that keeps humans and primates safe. They're not saying don't do it, just do it responsibly.
What can my audience do if they want to help gibbons?
I think one of the biggest things, conservation always needs money, and we have a Save the Gibbon grant on the SSA website. But to be honest, not everyone has money. But people need to know about these animals. It's very difficult to get people to care about something if you don't know about it. So spread the word about the singing, swinging apes. Go onto the website www.gibbons.asia. There's so much information on there about them. I'm trying to get recordings of every single gibbon species call on there so you can listen to it. Everything on there is free.
For those that have money, where would be a good place to send it if they want to help gibbons? So do you have any recommendations for people doing good work?
I have many. If you want a simple way of doing it, again, send it through the IUCN section on small apes. Any money that comes through there, we put into our Save the Gibbon grant that is people in the habitat countries can apply for. The money will all go to countries where gibbons live. It doesn't go to zoos outside of gibbon range states. There's a donate button on the website, and all the money goes to, like I said, it goes to people in the countries who are doing work to save gibbons. And there are many, many, many other gibbon projects I'm sure you can find if you want to donate to them directly. But like I said, just tell people about the gibbons. That would be amazing.
Fabulous. Well, thanks again, Susan, and thanks for all your good work, and thanks for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for letting me talk about the singing, swinging apes. It's much appreciated.
That's our show. Again, thank you to Dr. Cheyne for your time. Thank you to all of you for listening. Thank you to the donors for supporting the show. Again, you can donate at macandmurphy.org to support species. And I'll be looking forward to discussing today's episode with all of you in my Instagram broadcast channel and the YouTube comments section. Enjoy what's left of your weekend, and until I speak to you next, remember to be kind to animals.